It's Tuesday morning in Lagos. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the program. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. Our attention is turned to the Supreme Court judgment from last week. The Plateau State Governor, Caleb Mutfwang, is still basking in the euphoria of his victory at the Supreme Court, which last week reversed his sack at the Court of Appeal. He's now commended the neutrality of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the courage of the justices of the Supreme Court during his time in court. He said that their actions have left an indelible mark on the hearts of people of Plateau State who are now rolling out drums to celebrate his victory at the Apex Court. Recall that the Supreme Court affirmed the election of 8 governors, including the governors of Kano and Zamfara, who were sacked by the Court of Appeal last year. Others are governors of Ebonyi, Bauchi, Lagos, Abia, and Cross River State. A 5-man member panel of the Supreme Court, led by Justice Inyang Okoro, in unanimous judgment, set aside the decisions of the Court of Appeal Abuja Division in the appeals challenging the election of Governor Mutfwang. Presiding Justice Inyang said that a lot of people have suffered from the decision of the lower court. Recall that 2 senators, 4 members of the House of Representatives, and about 16 members of the Plateau State House of Assembly were removed from office by the Court of Appeal on account of the same facts and issues on which the Apex Court has now restored Governor Mutfwang. I'm joined this morning by constitutional lawyer and political affairs analyst, Dr. Tunji Abayomi. Good morning, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, and a Happy New Year to you.
Same to you.
So when you hear the Plateau governor commend the neutrality of the president and what he calls the courage of the justices of the Supreme Court justices, what comes to mind? Because these are supposed to be non-negotiable, right?
Well, I think it's actually ordinary in the sense that justices of the Supreme Court all over the world, because of the preeminence of their position, to lay principles of law according to law, taking into consideration the expectation of the Constitution. You will recall that in one of the justices said, in interpreting the Constitution,
Indeed.
Justices must bear in mind the expectation of the people. The whole essence of democracy is the right of the people to constitute government over themselves. That's expected to be preeminent. A situation where a court defeats that essential duty and authority of the people is to be held suspect. That is the thinking, the fundamental foundation of the decision of the Supreme Court. So if we are going to invalidate an election that is affirmed by the electors through their votes, it has to be on a very strong, cogent, convincing, and concrete ground. And if we look at all the decisions from the presidential election up until now, that principle has been affirmed by the Supreme Court.
So the justices are expected to be courageous. And the president is expected to be neutral. Does he even have any right over the judgment of the Supreme Court?
He doesn't at all.
So when they say, thank you, President, for being neutral, it sounds like maybe previous presidents have had their hands.
Well, the truth of the matter is a president is exceedingly powerful in a nation because he carries the collective authority of all the citizens to execute law. A perverse president can turn the nation upside down. He can influence the judiciary for bad. I believe that the thinking of the governor of Plateau State and his gratitude is that he's convinced that the present president, did not take perverse steps to turn the law against justice, Rather, he left the judiciary to act as the judiciary deems fit.
So when the Supreme Court gives judgment of this nature, you hear people say now the governor can focus on the business of government. Yes. How much of a distraction really are cases of this nature for the governor?
The reality of the matter is that election petition is a whole lot of distraction in our country. And I think that the decisions of the Supreme Court heretofore, particularly the decisions this year, is essentially affirming that, look, there's too much trouble here. I mean, we are talking of a situation now where there was no government since election. And some of these elections were in May. We're now talking of about more than 7 months of uncertainty and insecure leadership. So the distraction is substantial. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the distraction also is substantial for the judiciary. We're not talking of a situation where the justices have to give decisions within a very limited time. In this case, we are talking of 8 petitions in the Supreme Court. Just look at the volumes of what was taken to them. They have to read through those huge volumes, digest them, come to some opinion, have hearing, and then give a decision. Now, all these decisions for 8 petitions were given within 2 months.
By the way, those are just the first batch.
Yes.
The Supreme Court has now reserved judgment on some other cases.
Some others. So the distraction is substantial. And I think that if we are thinking, if the population, I'm talking of the political population, are really thinking, the focus now should be to ensure that we have a free and fair election. Not only that, to absorb in their vein some level of tolerance. Because again and again, it's almost impossible for us to accept electoral victory in our country. But the reality of the matter is only one person in a time.
And that's a big challenge, because the question has been asked often if it's productive for every election to end in litigation, even when it's obvious to the blind that the plaintiff really has no evidence to bring to court. Why do you think this has become more of a culture in our political climate, that the opposition must eventually go to court?
Well, I think the illusion of hope, I'll call it illusion of hope, that perhaps some kind of miraculous decision will change things.
And that has happened in the past. You see someone who came 3rd or 4th,
being
made governor by the court.
Of course, even in this election, you see what happened, for example, in Plateau, where, for example, all the legislators were removed by the decision of a court. A situation where the decision, of course, must be obeyed. If that decision is perverse or is abnormal, it turns justice upside down. So sometimes there's this illusion of hope that, in spite of non-possibility of my winning, I may just be lucky. And this is the reason. If you look at the presidential election as an example, for God's sake, I was on this station and I said that it will be an exercise in futility. Because if you look at the grounds on which we're going to the Supreme Court, they are basically nonsensical. To say, for example, that Abuja should be treated different from any other state, especially, or that the voters in Abuja must carry greater value than any other citizen. Or to say that a man who was not convicted, who was not tried, that because of some kind of something, he cannot become president. And you look at a situation here now where, for example, in the case of Sanwo-Olu, he's saying, or I think he's deputy to Sanwo-Olu, that because he has double, excuse me, he has double citizenship, exactly. Dual citizenship, in spite of the fact that the Constitution affirmatively says you can run for governorship if you are in Nigeria by birth. So some of these issues are simply not serious. But because of this illusion of hope, people still continue to push.
So politicians post-election, even after they've lost, they still want to use technicalities to find their way in.
Yes.
And then you wonder, why did people go to vote in the first place if, they can pick one loophole or the other and win from outside the ballot? But when you talk about perverse judgment, some say we may have a crisis of confidence in the appellate court as a fallout of the Supreme Court decision we saw last week, the overturning of verdicts of the Court of Appeal, where some 3 governorship election petitions are concerned. You had the Supreme Court justice criticize some justices of the Court of Appeal over the quality of their judgments.
Yes.
Where does this place our administration of justice in Nigeria?
Well, it's concerning. Let me tell you, it is concerning. Because if the Court of Appeal is up and doing, it makes the job of the Supreme Court much easier. The tendency of the Supreme Court is to affirm generally decisions that are favorable decisions in the High Court, affirmed by the Court of Appeal. When it gets to the Supreme Court, the tendency is for the Supreme Court to, support the decision. But when you have a decision in the case of, for example, Kano, where the decision was clearly perverse, you are talking of taking away over 165,000 votes, citizens' votes from the votes counted for Governor Yusuf out of it, and then, in a sense, you have nullified the votes of citizens for no just cause, and then you now declared his opponent to be duly elected. I mean, that is a very serious issue. So we have these type of situations, and that's why the Supreme Court is saying that the courts must be up and doing, must be serious enough, must examine these issues in an interest, looking at the interests of the people themselves. Like I said, the democracy is based on the authority of the people to constitute government over them. When you now invalidated 165,000 votes of the people in exercise of their authority to constitute government,
Indeed.
I think that is a serious issue. So there are concerning issues, but who deals with it? It's also the Supreme Court. I believe that they have already spoken very strongly, very firmly, and I'm sure that justices of the Supreme Court will be careful and serious and diligent, especially in applying the principles established by the Supreme Court to their decision. For example, it's been established again and again by the Supreme Court that when you're talking of nomination, no other party can question the process of nomination by another political party. And you cannot base the validity of election or its invalidity on the issue of nomination by another political party. And obviously, the Supreme Court was embarrassed by the failure of the Court of Appeal.
Because there's a rich precedence in this regard,
Yes.
From the Supreme Court. And this precedence is supposed to be, a...
Binding.
Yes,
Controlling.
binding on the lower courts, right?
Yes.
The same Court of Appeal made the same assertion while hearing the presidential election last year.
Yes.
And then so you wonder what went wrong, what really happened.
Well, it's difficult because, I mean, you can read through some of the opinions of senior lawyers who are demanding for examination, some kind of review of what's happening in some of these cases. Because it's a little bit, there's some level of concern, to be honest with you. Why will issue of nomination that has been decided again and again and again, even by the Court of Appeal, as not a valid ground to question election, become an issue in the case, for example, of Jaws. So it's a matter that, but again, let us understand that we are talking of several courts. If one court, for example, errs, there's always a remedy in the Supreme Court. So perhaps we should not be too overwhelmed, in my view, because there is, this concerning judgment as it is.
And the challenge in the case of the lawmakers in Plateau is that the Court of Appeal for them, is the Supreme Court. That's the final point of call. And now that, Governor Mutfwang's sack has been reversed, it seems like a huge disservice for them, the way they were removed by the Court of Appeal. But we're going to talk about that shortly. What do you make of the call by some lawyers who have asked the NJC to sanction the judges involved in what they now describe as a miscarriage of justice at the appellate court?
Well, they have been sanctioned already, as it should be, by the Supreme Court's opinion, but I don't think it's a ground. If you look at, there's no such law that allows the justice to be sanctioned merely because the decision of the court is presumed to be perverse.
But is that fair in and of itself? So if I say something wrong on TV, there's the NBC that brings a strike. My employer also can get me suspended. There's supposed to be correction where there is error. So if the justice or if the judge comes out with an error in its judgment, are you saying that the judges are above the law in and of itself?
They're not above the law. They are subject to the Supreme Court.
Is there a system that holds them accountable for the
not
judgment?
For the judgment, unless there is some kind of misdeed, corruption, etc. But because a judge has decided wrongly, is not a ground for sanctioning or for disciplinary processes. Because if you do that, you set a bad precedent. Again and again, decisions of court, whether right or wrong, must be obeyed. I mean, there are lots of it. Even the Supreme Court sometimes goes wrong and reverses itself. Sometimes. So, excuse me. So where do we really stop? It will be a dangerous precedent for the administration of justice. Now the court has gone wrong, but the truth of the matter is the same court that went wrong would have gone right in so many, many cases. I mean, I know the presiding justice in the Just Tribunal and the Just Court of Appeal. I mean, she's an exceptional jurist, So there was a wrong decision on this particular occasion.
I'm just wondering how you think that wouldn't repeat itself if judges are not held accountable for the error in their judgment. So what, stops them from doing it again? Because the judgment in and of itself is not supposed to be the opinion of the person. It's supposed to take its precedence from law. In this case, judgments, several judgments of such case at the Supreme Court. So you mentioned, for instance, you can't possibly, for a primary election matter, you can't come from APC and be probing what happened within the PDP. This is known to everybody. But then they still take it to court and judges still rule in the favor of such cases. And then you're beginning to wonder, who now holds them accountable if it begins to seem as if they're doing this on purpose?
Well, but if you say that, who holds the lawyer accountable is supposed to be guided by the law. The lawyer who presents a case and asking the justices to decide in his favor according to his submission, who holds him accountable, should we also punish him too? The other issue is that let us also remember we're not talking of only one judge. We are talking of at least 3 justices who gave a decision. And if you look at their decision, it's not entirely so absurd and so extremely perverse. Their position was that there was no primary by PDP, and if there was no primary, you cannot place an election on a non-existing primary. That was their position. Okay, so it's not something that is so extremely unreasonable. But the position of the Supreme Court and the justices so far is that a court should not look into that when you are determining the validity of an election, because it is not a condition to invalidate election. So I don't think it's a ground to discipline the justices.
So the big question right now is what happens to the 22 lawmakers in Plateau State. We have a report, following up on the development. 2 senators, 4 members of House of Reps, 16 members of the State Assembly who have now been sacked by the Court of Appeal on account of the same issues, upon which the Supreme Court has now restored Governor Mutfwang. Our Plateau State correspondent has a piece on this.
The Supreme Court judgment that confirmed Governor Caleb Mutfwang as the duly elected governor of Plateau State is now generating mixed reactions from residents on the fate of the sacked lawmakers of the PDP.
The Supreme Court judgment cleared the no structural ground used against People's Democratic Party by the All Progressive Congress and declared Governor Caleb Mutfwang as the rightful governor of Plateau State. The same no structural basis was used to sack all 16 lawmakers of the PDP in the state and those of the National Assembly by election tribunals and the Court of Appeal.
The members of the National Assembly, the new tribe of internally displaced politicians. They may be internally displaced, but they will return to their legitimate home.
There is the other side who argue that with the judgment of the Supreme Court that held that PDP complied with that judgment of Justice S.P. Gani, that held that it was unlawful for the Court of Appeal to have gone into the issue of nomination and sponsorship, that is the internal affairs of a party, and use that as a basis.
These lawmakers can, of course, it's going to be a novel thing in the history of election petition in Nigeria, because I, for one, have not had issues where there is a review on election petition matters. But this time around, they can test the waters, because the legal profession is a profession that everything is testable. They can test the waters to go for a judicial review, since the Supreme Court has set the law for us. The Supreme Court has said that the position of the Court of Appeal is perverse, which therefore it goes to mean that those lawmakers that were announced as returned as winners by the Court of Appeal, they are not in the real sense lawmakers.
Musa Bagos, a federal lawmaker from the PDP and a victim of the no structural judgment, shared his position on the development.
The court will still look at all those possible legal framework to be able to address these issues.
The next line of action from the judiciary is what the teeming populace of the state awaits to see. Funam Joshua, TVC News, Jos.
Well, it's interesting the way the governor has referred to them, internally displaced politicians, and it seems quite optimistic that they will return. So you've had a lot of, reactions in this regard. Some have said the Plateau government should approach the Supreme Court. Some have called for a judicial review. Some have said the Court of Appeal itself can review that decision. I had a lawyer yesterday who said there is no constitutional provision to have them return. Do you think there's a judicial remedy in this regard?
There's no judicial remedy. There is none. They cannot go to the Supreme Court. There's no provision for that. They cannot go back for review. This Court of Appeal functions officio. What it means is they cannot sit on that case anymore because it's finished. It's authority over the case concluded. The only thing that is available to them is to go back for election. They simply have to go. INEC would have...
At the expiration of their tenure?
No.
Okay.
They have been sacked.
Yes, they have been sacked.
By the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal is the Supreme Court for that particular election with regard to the legislative elections.
And that judgment favored the APC members?
Yeah.
The APC lawmakers?
Yeah, well, that's just it.
So they are sitting now as lawmakers. How do you have an election when there is someone sitting in that regard? So
they just wait for the next election.
For the next election, okay, that's the point you're making.
They will wait for the next election.
So where do you think the governor is getting that optimism from that they will return?
I do not know where he's getting it. With due respect, I think he's presuming that the judgment of the court, of the Supreme Court, can be brought to the Court of Appeal and be made binding and controlling but there's no provision for that.
The Speaker of the House of Assembly in Plateau, I think, is a member of the YPP.
Yes.
He came out recently to say that he will not grant recognition for those 16, what he called Court of Appeal ordered APC members, based on the Supreme Court nullification of the sacking of.
But he has no choice about that, because the decision of a court must be obeyed, whether it is right or wrong. It's important. There's no law that says that the decision of a court must always be right. For example, before you go on appeal, you are still bound by the decision of a court of law, even though...
Whether you consider it right or wrong.
Yes. In many cases, the decision will be reversed. That's why, for example, it said that an appeal does not stay the execution of a judgment. So it doesn't stop you from reaping the benefit of the judgment, even though the judgment, the decision may be reversed. So the controlling and binding effect of a wrong judgment, quote unquote, is still controlling. There's really nothing like a wrong judgment. A wrong judgment is a judgment that is reversed by a higher court.
Do you foresee a constitutional crisis here? Because the implication of the Court of Appeal judgment is that the majority has been taken away from the PDP.
Yes.
At the level of the State House of Assembly for a sitting governor who has just won at the Supreme Court.
Well, the point is that he will have to deal with the legislature. There's a new legislative house created by law. Let's understand that. There are two ways by which a legislative house can be created. It can be created by politics or created by law. It's created by politics in the way that you go through the process of election and you are elected there. It is created by law. When the law, by its workings, creates a new legislative house, it has been created by law. And that law is binding, but that our government may be a government of law and not of persons. So it must be understood. It is an unfortunate development in the sense that if you look at the decision of the Supreme Court, in essence, if the case had gone to the Supreme Court, obviously it would have been reversed. But the reality of the matter is that just as the Supreme Court has exclusive authority, overwhelming authority, and unappealable authority over the governorship election, the Court of Appeal has an unappealable authority over legislative elections. So we just simply have to wait for the next round. There have been cases, after all, where, these type of things happen to the benefit of PDP, in my view. So it happens again. You just have to continue to move forward, to the next election season.
I read a piece by the APC chairman in Plateau, saying that the party has accepted the Supreme Court judgment and, congratulating the governor and saying that they will work with him. I'm just wondering if you think the APC lawmakers have the moral basis to assume office based on the Supreme Court judgment. Do you think that on the basis of integrity they can say, you know what, I did not win this on merit, I'm not going to take up this position?
Well, if they do that, if they resign, then there will be an election. That doesn't mean...
Is that typical of a Nigerian politician?
Well, it won't happen. I can tell you. I can tell you, it's not going to happen. No Nigerian, no politician will internally displace himself. So use the governor's expression.
All right.
I can tell you that's not going to happen.
Let's take a short break. And when we return, we're going to open the phone lines and also get more reaction across board. Stay with us, everyone.
Lagos is the most